Between 1880 and 1929, America's wealthiest families constructed at least 47 elaborate private island estates along the eastern seaboard. By 1975, exactly 3 remained in their original family's hands. The rest had been seized by governments, sold for fractions of their construction costs, or simply abandoned to decay. Cumberland Island alone consumed $30 million in today's dollars for the Carnegie family, only to be surrendered to the National Park Service 40 years later. Yet one family's island compound not only survived but thrived, becoming more valuable with each passing decade. The difference wasn't wealth, location, or timing. It was a single decision made in a hotel room in 1947 by a widow who understood what her peers refused to accept. The story begins not with islands but with timber. Frederick Gilbert Bourne stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 210 pounds, and possessed what his competitors called an unnatural talent for seeing money where others saw only trees. Born in 1851 to a failed Massachusetts hat merchant, Bourne entered the business world at 14 as a clerk earning $3 weekly. He kept a notebook where he recorded not just transactions, but psychological observations about customers and rivals. By age 23, he had identified a pattern. Established companies consistently undervalued the relationship between raw material access and manufacturing efficiency. Bourne joined Singer Manufacturing Company in 1882 as a purchasing agent. Within 2 years, he had restructured their entire supply chain, personally negotiating timber contracts that reduced cabinet costs by 42%. His approach was methodical and ruthless. When Southern lumber suppliers attempted to form a pricing coalition in 1885, Bourne traveled to Georgia, purchased 14,000 acres of pine forest outright, and built Singer's own sawmill. The coalition collapsed within 6 months. By 1889, he was Singer's treasurer. By 1897, president. His compensation that year exceeded $400,000, equivalent to roughly $14 million today, but his personal holdings in timber and shipping dwarfed his salary. Yet Bourne faced a problem that money alone couldn't solve. New York society operated on ancestry, not achievement. The Astors, Vanderbilts, and Morgans maintained summer colonies in Newport and Bar Harbor that functioned as exclusive clubs. Bourne received invitations to business dinners, but never to the private gatherings where real social power transferred between generations. His wife Ellen came from respectable but undistinguished Hartford stock. Their 5 children attended proper schools, but lacked the casual intimacy with established families that defined true belonging. Bourne watched men with smaller fortunes and larger pedigrees treat him with courteous condescension. The rejection wasn't loud. It was the particular silence that followed his entrance into certain rooms. Others in Bourne's position pursued predictable paths. They built Newport cottages and waited for acceptance that rarely came. They married their daughters to European titles, trading American money for old-world legitimacy. George J. Gould spent $5 million on a Loire Valley chateau reproduction in Lakewood, New Jersey, hoping scale would compensate for his railroad baron father's coarse reputation. It didn't. William Kissam Vanderbilt II constructed a Long Island estate with 109 rooms and still found himself excluded from the most prestigious yacht clubs. The fundamental problem remained constant. In established enclaves, the wealthy newcomer was always a supplicant. Frederick Bourne studied these failures with the same analytical precision he brought to timber contracts. He observed that social gatekeepers held power only within their own territories. In Newport, they controlled everything. Beyond Newport, their influence diminished proportionally to distance. Bourne also noted something his peers missed. The most socially secure families didn't seek validation from others. They created self-contained worlds where their preferences defined reality. The Astors didn't attend other people's parties. They held their own, and attendance at Astor events became the mark of a rival. Dark Island sits in the St. Lawrence River, 4 miles from the Canadian border, equidistant between the tiny villages of Chippewa Bay and Hammond, New York. In 1903, the 3.5-acre parcel was worthless. Too small for farming, too remote for commercial development, too exposed to river ice for year-round habitation. The area attracted modest summer tourism, but nothing comparable to established resorts. Bourne purchased the island for $5,000 plus an adjacent 105 acres of mainland shoreline. His wife thought he'd lost his mind. His business associates assumed he wanted a rustic fishing retreat. None understood his actual objective. Bourne intended to build not a summer cottage, but a self-sufficient kingdom where he controlled every variable. While Frederick Bourne supplied the vision and money, Ernest Flagg provided the architectural philosophy that made Dark Island extraordinary. Flagg was 51 in 1908 when Bourne commissioned the project, already famous for designing the Singer Building in Manhattan, which briefly held the title of world's tallest structure. But Flagg's real passion was residential design, based on what he called democratic principles of space. He believed American architecture had become enslaved to European precedent, producing homes that required armies of servants and bankrupted even wealthy owners through maintenance costs. Flagg's approach for Dark Island synthesized castle aesthetics with modern efficiency. He designed a 28-room granite structure that looked medieval but functioned with cutting-edge technology. The walls were 2 feet thick, quarried from local limestone, and assembled by Italian stonemasons Bourne imported from Singer's European factories. Flagg incorporated 4 towers that served both decorative and practical purposes, housing water tanks that fed a gravity-based plumbing system requiring no external pumps. The building's central core contained a revolutionary heating system that used a single coal furnace to warm the entire structure through convection channels built into the walls themselves. The main hall stretched 40 feet, lined with hand-carved oak panels depicting maritime themes. Flagg designed every doorway, each set with leaded glass manufactured in Bourne's own factory. The library held 2,000 volumes behind floor-to-ceiling shelves, with a hidden stairway leading to Bourne's private office in the North Tower. This room, just 12 by 12 feet, commanded views of the river in all directions. From here, Bourne could see approaching boats while remaining invisible himself. The house included 8 bedrooms, each with private bathroom, unheard of luxury in 1908, when most Newport cottages had communal facilities. The dining room seated 16 beneath a domed ceiling, painted with constellations accurate to the island's precise latitude. Construction required 4 years and consumed $250,000, approximately $8 million today. Bourne hired 65 full-time workers and housed them in a mainland dormitory. Materials arrived by barge: 8,000 tons of granite, 12,000 board feet of mahogany, 4,000 square feet of Italian marble. The mainland property included stables for 18 horses, a working farm producing milk and vegetables, staff housing for 35 permanent employees, and a boathouse sheltering 6 vessels, including Bourne's 105-foot steam yacht. The entire complex operated as Bourne envisioned, completely independent of outside society. From 1910 until Bourne's death in 1919, Dark Island served its intended purpose perfectly. The family spent June through September there annually. Bourne's children learned sailing, fishing, and mechanical skills he considered more valuable than Newport's ornamental education. His daughter Marjorie married a naval officer at the Island Chapel, a structure Flagg designed to hold exactly 40 guests, which was precisely the number of people Bourne considered true friends. Business associates who visited came as genuine guests, not social climbers seeking favor. Bourne's peer group of self-made industrialists proved that the island's isolation actually enhanced its appeal. Andrew Carnegie wrote after a 1913 visit that he felt liberated from the exhausting performance of propriety. But beneath this success, an economic reality was emerging that would eventually threaten not just Dark Island, but every private estate in America. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, gave Congress the power to levy income taxes. Initially modest, rates escalated dramatically during World War I, reaching 77% for top earners by 1918. Bourne absorbed these costs easily, but the precedent was established. Government could now claim the majority of annual earnings from the wealthy. More ominously, estate taxes appeared in 1916, initially at 10% but climbing to 25% by 1924. For the first time, dynastic wealth transfer faced systematic government confiscation. Frederick Bourne died in March 1919 at age 67. His estate, valued at $12 million, faced immediate taxation of nearly $3 million. His widow Ellen inherited Dark Island and the maintenance burden it represented. Annual operating costs exceeded $40,000, equivalent to $650,000 today, requiring staff, fuel, maintenance, and property taxes that New York State had recently tripled. The children had married and established separate lives. None wanted to assume responsibility for an isolated island requiring year-round attention. Ellen was 61, in declining health, and faced the question that would soon haunt hundreds of wealthy American families. What do you do with a property too expensive to maintain, but too meaningful to abandon? The collapse began almost immediately. In 1920, the Phipps family sold their 287-acre Jupiter Island estate in Florida after just 18 years of ownership. The Stotesbury Mansion Wingwood House on the main line outside Philadelphia, which cost $8 million to build in 1921, was demolished in 1949, surviving only 28 years. Henry Clay Frick's Eagle Rock Estate in Massachusetts, completed in 1904, was torn down in 1969. The pattern was consistent and brutal. Properties that represented decades of wealth accumulation couldn't survive a single generation of elevated taxation and changed social conditions. Carnegie's Cumberland Island represented the most dramatic example. Andrew Carnegie's widow Lucy built Plum Orchard Mansion there in 1898, a 30,000-square-foot tabby concrete structure requiring 40 full-time staff. The island encompassed 16,000 acres, larger than Manhattan. Annual maintenance exceeded $200,000 by the 1930s. The Carnegie heirs tried every solution. They reduced staff, closed wings, delayed repairs. Nothing worked. The fundamental economics were impossible. A property requiring $200,000 annually to maintain would need to generate equivalent value to its owners. But private enjoyment could not justify that cost. In 1972, the family donated the entire island to the National Park Service, receiving a tax deduction worth perhaps 1/10 of the property's theoretical market value. The wealthy discovered that changing tax policy was only part of their problem. The servant class that made vast estates functional was disappearing. In 1910, 1 million Americans worked in domestic service. By 1950, that number had fallen to 1.5 million, despite population growth from 92 million to 150 million. Young people who once would have considered household positions now found factory work, paying twice the wages with better hours and more dignity. Running Dark Island with 35 staff in 1915 was expensive but possible. By 1945, finding even 12 reliable people willing to work on an isolated island at any price was nearly impossible. Ellen Bourne died in 1947. Her children faced the expected decision. The island had been closed since 1942, when wartime fuel rationing made heating the massive structure impossible. 5 years of neglect had taken a visible toll. The roof leaked in 3 places. Ice damage had cracked some granite. The boathouse needed complete rebuilding. Estimates for restoration exceeded $100,000. Annual maintenance would require at least $50,000. Property taxes, which New York had raised again in 1946, added another $8,000. The heirs met in New York City to discuss options. They could donate the property to New York State, following the Cumberland Island model. They could sell it, though buyers for island castles were non-existent in 1947. They could attempt to maintain it as a family trust, pooling resources from multiple households. Or they could demolish the structure, sell the materials, and liquidate the land for whatever hunting clubs or developers might pay. Each option meant accepting that Frederick Bourne's vision of dynastic permanence had lasted exactly 1 generation. The castle he built to transcend social limitations would join the growing graveyard of American private estates. What happened next changed everything. Marjorie Bourne Thayer, Frederick's daughter, proposed a solution that her siblings considered both desperate and undignified. She wanted to open Dark Island to paying visitors, not as a museum with velvet ropes and guided tours, but as a functional resort hotel where wealthy guests could rent the castle by the week. They would live in the family's bedrooms, dine in the family's dining room, and enjoy the family's island exactly as the Bournes had. The idea horrified her brothers. Their father had built Dark Island specifically to escape public exposure. Opening it to strangers felt like betrayal. Marjorie argued from pure practicality. The property had three possible fates: decay, donation, or income generation. Only the third preserved both the structure and family ownership. She pointed out that the very remoteness her father had valued now worked against them. No institution wanted responsibility for a building accessible only by boat. No buyer existed for a single family island estate in 1947, but wealthy people tired of conventional resorts might pay premium rates for authentic castle experiences. The key was framing the offering correctly. This wouldn't be a hotel. It would be a private club where members rented the entire property for exclusive use. The Bourne children voted 3-2 in favor of Marjorie's plan. In spring 1948, Dark Island opened as a rental property. The rate was $5,000 per week, equivalent to $62,000 today, including full staff service. The first season attracted just 3 bookings, generating $15,000 against operating costs of $55,000. But the second season brought 7 bookings. By 1952, Dark Island was booked solid June through September, at rates that had climbed to $8,000 weekly. The economics worked because the property offered something genuinely scarce. In an era when even the wealthy traveled to standardized resort hotels, Dark Island provided authentic exclusivity. The guest experience was carefully curated to feel like visiting wealthy friends rather than staying at a hotel. Staff wore period uniforms but avoided servile behavior. Meals used the Bourne family china and silver. The library's books were available for reading. Guests could operate the boats themselves or have staff captain. Children were encouraged to explore exactly as young Bournes had. The rules were simple. Treat the property respectfully, tip the staff generously, and maintain the fiction that you were temporary aristocracy rather than paying customers. Most guests embraced this framework enthusiastically. Success attracted imitators, but also highlighted what made Dark Island unusual. Several other families attempted similar conversions of their estates. The results were almost uniformly disastrous. The fundamental problem was scale and accessibility. Most private estates were either too large, requiring dozens of staff and costs that exceeded what guests would pay, or too accessible, located near population centers where commercial hotels offered better value. Dark Island occupied a sweet spot. It was large enough to feel genuinely impressive but small enough to operate with modest staff. It was remote enough to justify premium pricing, but accessible enough by car and boat to reach without airplane travel. Frederick Bourne's son, Harold, died in 1954, leaving his shares to his children. This third generation faced their own decisions. None had lived at Dark Island as children. To them it was a profitable business, not a family home. One grandchild proposed selling the entire operation to a hotel chain. Another wanted to maintain status quo. The deadlock was broken by Harold Bourne Jr., who had studied hotel management at Cornell and saw larger possibilities. He argued that Dark Island could expand beyond summer rentals by adding winter programming, building additional structures, and marketing more aggressively. Harold Jr.'s vision transformed the property over the next 2 decades. In 1956, he added a winterized guest cottage that could house 4 people during off-season. In 1961, he purchased 2 adjacent islands, expanding the property to 15 acres. He developed ice fishing packages, promoted Dark Island for corporate retreats, and partnered with hunting lodges to create package experiences. By 1970, the property generated $180,000 annually, while maintaining the castle exactly as Frederick Bourne had built it. The success came from understanding that preservation and profit were allies, not enemies. Revenue funded maintenance that kept the property authentic, and authenticity justified premium pricing that generated revenue. The business model established several principles that other preservation efforts would eventually adopt. First, meaningful preservation requires ongoing income, not one-time donations. Museums funded by endowments struggle when markets decline. Properties generating operational income adapt to economic conditions. Second, exclusive access commands greater premiums than mass tourism. Dark Island hosted perhaps 400 guests annually, but each paid rates that made the economics work. Third, authentic experience requires accepting that buildings must function, not simply exist. The castle remained vital because people actually lived in it, testing its systems and demanding that everything work properly. Today, Dark Island operates under its fourth generation of Bourne family management. The property hosts approximately 60 rentals annually, each paying between $15,000 and $45,000, depending on season and length. Annual revenue exceeds $1.8 million. Staff numbers fluctuate between 8 year-round and 25 during summer. The economic impact on the local area is substantial. The property employs local people, purchases supplies from regional vendors, and attracts visitors who spend money in surrounding communities. Dark Island has become integrated into the area's economy in ways that private-only use never accomplished. The legal structure is deliberately simple. The property remains privately owned by a family LLC. It is not a non-profit, receives no tax subsidies, and accepts no government funding. This independence was intentional. Harold Jr. believed that accepting tax benefits would eventually lead to accepting government restrictions on how the property operated. He studied what happened to families who donated estates for tax deductions and concluded that maintenance control always followed. By keeping Dark Island fully private and fully taxed, the family retained complete operational autonomy. For visitors today, Dark Island represents something paradoxical. It's a castle built by industrial wealth to escape social judgment, now accessible only to those who can afford rates that exceed what most Americans earn monthly. Its preservation through commercialization, exclusivity maintained by selling access. For the local community, it's a stable employer in an economically marginal region. For historians and architects, it's a nearly perfect example of Flagg's work and Gilded Age construction techniques. For the Bourne family, it's proof that their great-grandfather's vision could survive by transforming its fundamental purpose while maintaining its physical form. The contrast with other private islands is striking. Cumberland Island, donated to become public land, now welcomes 60,000 visitors annually through a permit system. The experience is authentic in some ways, but completely removed from the property's intended purpose. Jupiter Island properties were subdivided and developed into exclusive residential communities where the original estates disappeared entirely. The Phipps vision became a gated suburb. Only Dark Island functions today essentially as Frederick Bourne intended, as a self-contained retreat where a small number of people escape ordinary life for brief periods. The answer to why America's richest families stopped building private islands lies in these divergent outcomes. It wasn't that they stopped wanting privacy or exclusivity, it was that the economic and social conditions that made such properties viable disappeared within a single generation. Tax policy made accumulation of dynastic capital nearly impossible. Labor shortages made operation of grand estates impractical. Social changes made ostentatious private displays increasingly uncomfortable. The families who built Cumberland Island, Jupiter Island, and dozens of others discovered their magnificent properties had become magnificent liabilities. Dark Island survived because one person recognized that changing the property's purpose could preserve its form. Marjorie Bourne Thayer's 1947 decision to rent the castle wasn't motivated by vision or principle. It was desperate pragmatism. She had no interest in seeing her father's creation demolished or donated. Converting it to income production was the only path that kept family ownership and physical preservation aligned. That practical decision established a model that subsequent generations refined and expanded. The deeper lesson extends beyond islands and castles. Dark Island demonstrates that preservation requires adaptation. Objects and structures that cannot generate value in changed circumstances will not survive, regardless of their historical or aesthetic significance. The families who donated their estates to become parks or museums transferred the preservation burden to institutions that often lacked resources for proper maintenance. Many donated properties deteriorated faster after becoming public than they would have under continued private ownership. Dark Island's commercial success provided the economic foundation for authentic preservation in ways that charitable donation never could. Morning sun still strikes the North Tower exactly as Frederick Bourne saw it in 1910. The main hall's oak panels retain their original luster, maintained by revenue generated from guests who pay premium rates to experience what he built. The granite walls are as solid as when Italian stonemasons set them. Water still flows through gravity-fed pipes that Ernest Flagg designed. The castle works because it must work. It generates income because guests demand functional luxury. It preserves the past by remaining useful in the present. The paradox Frederick Bourne never anticipated was that his castle would outlast every comparable private island, not by remaining private, but by sharing itself strategically. Where others chose to cling to original purpose until forced to surrender, Dark Island transformed its purpose to preserve its form. The wealthy families who built elaborate islands in the Gilded Age stopped building them because they learned such properties couldn't survive unchanged. The property that did survive learned that to endure required accepting that the future would not repeat the past. Sometimes the only way to keep something is to let it become something else carefully and on your own terms, before circumstances force crude transformations you cannot control.